écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Bonjour. Au nom d'ICLEI Africa, le Centre africain pour les villes, nos villes, la Croix-Rouge, le Centre climatique et nos partenaires, sommes ravis de vous accueillir à l'Action Festival Rise Africa 2022. Rise Africa a grandi depuis 2020 comme plateforme pour les penseurs, les faiseurs, les catalyseurs, engagés à inspirer de l'action pour des villes durables. Le thème de cette année, c'est la créativité. Pour moi, cela veut dire mélanger les compétences, être en mesure de communiquer la complexité du changement climatique dans des villes qui s'urbanisent vite. Je pense que nous avons beaucoup de potentiel à encore exploiter en matière de créativité en Afrique. Il y a encore beaucoup d'histoires de l'Afrique à raconter. Beaucoup de gens sur le continent africain sont créatifs dans leur approche des différents défis. La créativité en Afrique, c'est le dynamisme et s'accaparer notre connaissance autochtone. La prise en main, c'est une manière de donner le pouvoir au peuple, aux groupes, aux jeunes, surtout dans un continent où la population est très jeune. Et cette approche de réunir chacun ne nécessite pas d'avoir simplement des experts ou des représentants des gouvernements de haut niveau. Pour moi, la prise en main, c'est le changement, du bas vers le haut. L'importance de l'urgence, c'est reconnaître le passé et reconnaître qu'on a perdu du temps. L'urgence, c'est agir maintenant pour construire des villes plus productives, plus inclusives et résilientes. Il faut créer les villes, désapprendre et explorer de nouvelles manières de penser. Nous avons 33 sessions, 135 provocateurs de toutes les régions d'Afrique et du monde. Chaque session a pour but de montrer de nouvelles idées, des actions en cours et lancer de nouvelles initiatives en réunissant les participants pour créer un nouveau chemin. Nous espérons que le programme du festival va vous inspirer. Au festival, nous vous encourageons à présenter vos activités, vos projets, créer des partenariats et exploiter votre potentiel créatif, vous engager à des actions durables. Rise Africa, c'est traduire des idées en actions. Alors, à quelles actions allez-vous vous engager pendant ce festival? Avant le début de la session, il est important de noter que vous êtes enregistré. En participant, vous donnez votre consentement pour être enregistré. Tous les enregistrements seront disponibles sur la page du programme après le festival. L'expression créative est vitale pour créer de nouveaux avenirs pour nos villes. Et nous vous invitons donc à entrer dans cette session avec cet esprit de créativité et de rêve.
I don't expect you to clown yourselves and collapse the distance and difference between sharing bread and sharing bed. I know that feeling, so give me a break and stop the fake. They say a hungry man is an angry man, but I say I am not hungry, I am hunger. I am not angry, I am anger. I am not dangerous, I am danger. I am an abominable time bomb, able to blast limestones and thunderbolts because somehow I am torn, tried and tired. So you see, you don't have to hear the sound of my voice before you know that hunger is real, scarcity is not. So please, check the time. It's history time, passion time, meaning time, access time, free flow time, sharing time, bread time, your time, my time, our time. Now, oh, now is urgent time.
Bonjour à tous, bienvenue et merci d'avoir rejoint notre session aujourd'hui intitulée « Les preuves justifient-elles l'économie circulaire comme voie de développement pour l'Afrique ?» Si vous voulez bien me laisser un moment, je vais partager avec vous mon écran. Nous espérons que jusqu'à présent, vous appréciez ce festival et que vous avez hâte des sessions suivantes. Notre session actuelle est organisée par ICLEI, que je représente, Jokudu Guya, avec mon collègue Matthew, nos collègues Deborah Narty, qui est analyste de recherche, et Eric Roos Lindgren, qui est un consultant en recherche sur l'économie circulaire. Nous allons étudier les mesures de l'économie circulaire et les différentes informations et processus nécessaires. Nous allons débuter dans un instant et nous allons vous présenter tout d'abord Footprints Africa. Ensuite, nous ouvrirons la discussion et nous espérons que vous êtes prêts à discuter et dialoguer avec nous. Ensuite, nous discuterons, nous parlerons de notre étude avec un entretien d'ICLEI, puis nous en apprendrons plus sur les indicateurs de l'économie circulaire avec Footprints Africa. Enfin, nous aurons de nouveau une discussion sur ces mesures de l'économie circulaire. Avant d'aller plus loin, nous allons vous donner un aperçu de ICLEI Africa. ICLEI est un réseau mondial qui travaille avec plus de 2500 organisations locales et gouvernements locaux et régionaux. Nous plaidoyons pour une gouvernance locale et sous-régionale depuis plus de 30 ans. Comme vous pouvez le voir sur cette carte, nous sommes présents à travers le monde entier. Et en bas, vous pouvez voir notre secrétariat en Afrique du Sud. ICLEI Africa a pour objectif de s'aligner également avec une vision mondiale, mais également avec nos partenaires africains. Sur le continent, notre portée touche plus de 450 cités et régions. Nous essayons d'avoir des actions au niveau local à travers 5 voies. Le développement des émissions, des faibles émissions, le développement d'actions basées sur la nature, mais également centrées sur les personnes et l'équitabilité, la résilience et l'économie circulaire. Nous invitons les gouvernements locaux à réfléchir et à adopter une approche holistique. Je vais maintenant laisser la parole pour que nos collègues vous donnent un aperçu de Footprints Africa. Merci Jokudu pour cette présentation et bienvenue à tous ici. Nous sommes ravis de vous avoir avec nous. Footprints Africa est une société dont la vision est de vivre dans un monde le plus inclusif et régénératif possible. Notre mission est de prouver que les entreprises peuvent être une force de changement dans le bon sens. Nous soutenons la transition en Afrique vers une économie circulaire. Pour nous, une économie circulaire n'est pas très présente en Afrique, mais nous essayons de faire ressortir ce qui existe déjà en Afrique et d'impliquer les gens pour qu'ils puissent avoir des exemples tangibles de ce qui est possible de répliquer et donc de passer à une économie plus circulaire en Afrique. Il y a différents projets que nous menons où nous soutenons les entreprises. Vous pourrez avoir plus d'informations sur nos projets sur notre site Internet. En ce qui concerne l'économie circulaire, nous avons commencé par des études de cas à travers le pays afin de construire une base de données sur les initiatives d'économie circulaire sur le continent. Et nous avons décidé de faire cela parce que nous voulions pouvoir apporter des données et également des preuves des économies circulaires pour soutenir les entrepreneurs locaux et qu'ils puissent partager leurs histoires sur une plateforme mondiale. Nous avons donc fait une cartographie de ces cas avec cette carte géospatiale. Vous pouvez voir qu'il y a des cas sur le savoir-faire. L'objectif est que les 450 cas que nous avons étudiés puissent être cartographiés et partagés avec tous ceux que cela intéresse. Nous avons également été en mesure de réaliser 2 rapports à partir de cette base de données. Voilà les 2 rapports que nous avons publiés et nous sommes en cours d'en réaliser un 3e. Le premier est un aperçu de l'économie circulaire en Afrique et notre parcours jusqu'à présent, c'est le titre qu'on lui a donné. Le deuxième était un rapport thématique sur l'agriculture régénératrice, un rapport thématique sur l'environnement. Maintenant, à partir des études de cas que nous avons cartographiées, nous avons été en mesure de développer d'autres projets. L'un d'entre eux, nous allons vous en parler aujourd'hui, c'est le projet d'évaluation de l'économie circulaire. Nous voulons pouvoir apporter des preuves, des données tangibles pour que les entrepreneurs sachent ce qu'ils font et prouver que l'économie circulaire est un moyen de protéger notre environnement et d'avoir cette régénération que nous souhaitons obtenir. Donc, si vous êtes intéressé, nous pourrons en discuter plus en détail aussi plus tard. Nous allons donc maintenant nous pencher plus particulièrement sur le projet dans cette session, mais avant de rentrer dans les détails, je voulais vous poser 2 questions. Et on va donc se diviser en groupes. On a ces 2 questions qu'on aimerait dont vous puissiez débattre entre vous. Pourquoi devons-nous, d'après vous, évaluer l'économie circulaire et si on évalue l'économie circulaire, est-ce qu'on doit prendre en compte l'aspect qualitatif ou quantitatif et comment? Voilà, nous aimerions entendre vos réponses. Donc, on va se diviser en petits groupes maintenant. Comme je l'ai dit, nous aimerions que vous vous organisiez entre vous et définir dans vos groupes la personne qui nous donnera la réponse du groupe. Si vous êtes d'accord, envoyez votre réaction avec un pouce en l'air et ensuite on va se diviser en groupes le plus vite possible. Je ne vois pas personne qui a levé le pouce. Merci Eric. Nicole, Cyril, si tout est clair pour vous, on va juste lancer les discussions de groupe. Si vous avez des questions, si vous voulez des précisions, n'hésitez pas à me le dire maintenant avant qu'on passe en groupe. Ok, je pense que tout le monde est d'accord. Donc, on va se diviser en groupe pendant 10 minutes. Ensuite, on se retrouve dans la session principale. À tout à l'heure.
Welcome back. I think we're having everyone back now, if I'm not mistaken. So, as we already heard before, I would like to do a little recap of what we just discussed in the breakout rooms and see how it connects to what we will discuss later in terms of the measurement of circular economy. So the way we were thinking to do this, we briefly ask you to appoint some rapporteurs, some of the group leaders. And what I would like to do is give a small recap of what happened in our breakout room and then invite some of the group leaders to shine their light on the assessment questions that we asked you. We have around 10 minutes for this. So we started with asking the participants, well, what do you consider? What do you first think of when you consider circular economy measurement? And why would you do that? And something very interesting that came up in our breakout room is the issue of comparability and the abundance of circular economy metrics that seems to be out there and that was recognized by the participants. And then the question, well, what if some of these metrics give contrasting scores or outcomes when you apply them to the same case? How do you compare that? And then we talked a bit more about the why. So why would you use them? And one of the participants had a really interesting point that you can use them for these comparisons, but that you can also use them for your, let's say, internal performance of your company, of your business. So let's say you have been working on implementing circular measures for the past years, or you're planning to do that in the future, to use these indicators to kind of track progress towards these goals. We also talked about, well, if there's so many of these circular economy metrics available, do we know if they're actually used? And one of the topics there was about, let's say, the availability of metrics, but also their accessibility. So one of the participants had a really interesting point on that most businesses are perhaps not in the position to really take a deep dive into metrics and assessment because of, well, for instance, the high costs and resource intensive nature that is usually associated with applying metrics. So that was a bit of a recap of what we discussed, but I would be very happy to open the floor. And any of the group rapporteurs, please jump in to tell us about your most surprising finding from these questions.
Eric, so I just wanted to see if I could call people in my group. Hi, Dashana or Patricia. We had a really interesting discussion, and if it would be nice to hear your voice to share what we discussed. It could be either Dashana or Patricia.
Yeah, I don't mind sharing some, and if
Thank
Patricia
you.
wants to add in, she can as well.
Sure.
So I think we started by saying that it really is important to, have data in the circular economy to measure the impacts, because you'd want to do an evidence-based pathway of whatever kind of pathway you choose. It was also important because as we move from a linear to a circular economy, you need some sort of baseline to look at, so you know whether you are actually moving towards a circular economy to start with. And I think everyone in our group, acknowledged that you need to actually monitor and track progress using data-driven insights. An interesting point was in terms of standardization. So that was something we spoke about quite a bit in terms of there isn't really even a standardized definition of circular economy. So how do you measure it? And yeah, that kind of brought us to, would it be easy or hard to measure or standardize different data sets, just because data can be so easily manipulated. So we do agree that, you can't just have a whole bunch of different kind of equations that don't actually mean anything. So that's when data can actually become not that meaningful, and you can go into kind of analysis paralysis where you aren't really getting anything meaningful from data. And then I think we said, qualitative data is also really important to actually explain quantitative data, but also in terms of measuring attitudes or behavior, giving context. So yeah, Patricia, please add if there's anything else you feel is interesting.
Yes, thank you, Deshania. I think you've highlighted most of the points we discussed. Maybe just one issue was how to address the issue of standardization. As I said, it needs to be need-based. Even when you're doing a survey or you're measuring circularity, in that sense, you won't now the results going into the shelves or just keeping it in the library. So when you have comprehensive stakeholder involvement and you have the right team, and whether you're measuring the circularity within an industry, institution, a city, or a country, and you have the subjects part of the team, then it will be easier to implement what you're doing, so that there's that sense of ownership. I think that's what we had said about, yeah, even if you're measuring what next after we measure. And yes, and about also the definitions. As we said, even in other sectors, there's some or even studies that have been done, you'll find different organizations coming up with different results. But what matters is the essence of, I think there's a common understanding of what circular economy is. So as we discussed, as long as the the subjects of the institution, understand why what they want to measure, then you can proceed, because yes, you need to make decisions from that measurement that has been done. I think that's what I can add to what we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. These are really interesting insights. I'm writing everything down because this is also, for me, I want to be able to base any kind of measurement work on, for example, the notion that it should be needs-based. I think that's extremely relevant. What I also find a very interesting insight is to have this common understanding of what a circular economy means. That is something that will come back in the presentation in a bit, about all these different definitions of circular economy. These are reflected in the huge amount of metrics that seem to be available. I think providing an evidence-based pathway, as you said, Deshanya, was really crucial as well, to be able to show the impacts not only within the company, but perhaps also to your customers, perhaps also to investors, and pretty much everyone who needs to see that the impacts that circular economy strategies promise are actually realized. So I think you really hit the nail on the head and really listed some of the most crucial elements that form part of this measurement domain. Is there anyone else, any other rapporteur that still has something on his or her mind to reflect on now? Otherwise, we can proceed. Okay, that seems to be it for now. I think we're right on schedule. So what I will do now is I will share my screen. Then we will continue with a bit of presentation on the more qualitative side of circular economy measurement. Thanks very much for your inputs.
All right, thanks, Eric. I think that was an interesting conversation we had right there. So I'm going to be speaking to Matthew, and Jakodu introduced him earlier, but he's going to speak a little about himself and what he does with ICLEI. And Matthew has been working with ICLEI on a project that is focusing on doing a baseline survey to prove circularity in cities. And so we'd like to hear about their work. It's similar to what Footprints is doing, trying to measure the circular economy, but they are using qualitative data. And in my group, when we're doing the discussion, one thing that came up was that there is a need to have both qualitative and quantitative data measured, because the qualitative gives you the meaning behind the figures that you're going to see. So Matthew, hi. I think you're now speaking, so I could say welcome. And do you want to tell us about yourself and what you do and a little about the project?
Great, thank you so much, Deborah, and thanks everybody for being here and the kind of fascinating discussion that's already taken place. It's really exciting to be able to showcase our work and hopefully get a bit of feedback from you all on what we're doing. So maybe just to start, my name is Matthew Hoover. Thanks for the introduction, Deborah. I work at ICLEI Africa as a professional officer in circular development and mobility as well. But today we're going to speak a little bit about the baselining approach that we've adopted as part of a project called the African Circular Cities Initiative. And just to give you a bit of background on the project kind of aims to develop an African approach to the implementation of circular economy in cities. And through the project, we kind of aim to support local government to articulate a vision for a circular economy in their cities, share some of the work that's currently ongoing and kind of, the projects that are taking place already, and really leverage that to kind of move their transition forward, whether through gaining attention from key stakeholders or leveraging it for funding. As part of the project, we kind of got 4 interlinked parts. One is this qualitative baselining survey that we'll be speaking a bit more about now. The gathering and development of case studies as part of like the showcasing element of the project. A series of 4 trainings around circular economy topics that have been selected by the cities involved that they feel are most important for their specific context. And then also the hope for development and implementation of a methodological guide for the development of actions, frameworks, and roadmaps in African cities. So yeah, that's a little bit about the project and where the baselining survey fits in.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. think you've shared the different aspects of the project, but we are going to focus this discussion on the qualitative baseline survey. So may I ask why you decided to go with qualitative data for this baselining work?
Sure. Eric, if you could go on to the next slide. So I think what's really important when we're measuring circular economy, measuring anything for that matter, is really understanding, what we want to achieve or what the goal or the outcome is of the research or the survey. And in our case, the idea is to understand circularity from a variety of city contexts, understand the challenges, desires, and visions for a circular economy in different cities. And this really lends itself to drawing on lived experiences, perceptions, which can all be achieved through a qualitative approach. So kind of in a summary, the purpose of the survey is to gain understanding of the circular economy in a variety of different African cities, okay? So gaining insight, in African cities, circular economy, progress and journeys. So what is happening in the city in terms of circular economy already? What projects are taking place? Quite often quantitative data is available. So trying to use that as a measure as a measure for where a city is on its circular economy journey may not be effective as actually speaking to people working on the ground and saying what sort of projects are taking place, what sort of initiatives have you got ongoing, how successful have they been, and what sort of impact are they having on the people that you work with. Another important thing is understanding the perceptions from local government officials around circular economy topics and ideas. So how do people feel about the circular economy? What is the circular economy to them? As we discussed earlier, there's so many different definitions and so different people interpret the idea of the circular economy in so many different ways. So really kind of drill down into the way people think about circular economy and what it means to them is a really important part of the survey as well. We also want to gain insight into the approaches taken by different cities, as well as different technical and political offices in these cities. So within cities, obviously, people work in different departments, different sectors. Again, everybody's got a different idea, a different approach, and we want to try and get an understanding of all of those approaches and all of those ideas and how they all kind of fit into the city's vision of a circular economy and what sort of benefits the circular economy poses and what sort of challenges can be overcome through implementing circular economy principles and ideas. I think to summarize, I was thinking about this last week, but quantitative data kind of tells us what is happening, maybe tells us what is happening. I'm going to say maybe tells us what, but the qualitative really tells us why it was so what related to, what is happening in the city. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of why we've used a qualitative approach and how it kind of fits into our work with cities.
Yeah, interesting. So I know that I could say it's an established fact that could be argued out that the concept of circular economy is not new in Africa and it's something we've always practiced, right? But it has not been institutionalized. And so following the traces and getting to know why people do it is quite a challenge, and you have to go through the process. It'll be very difficult to go through that process. What I'm wondering is, now you're doing it with local governments, and we know that across Africa, we're talking about so many countries having various setups for their local governments. So what kind of data or what type of data is this survey looking to collect, and what influenced the choice of these questions that you are using to collect this data?
Cool, thanks, Deborah. So basically, we've got 7 overarching categories of questions. And I'll go through them one by one and just kind of a brief explanation of what they are and what's it. The first is circular vision. And this kind of really speaks to the idea of what do officials see the circular economy providing in their city? What does circular economy mean for their city? And as you say, this could be drawing on existing concepts, things that have existed for a long time in their context, or it could be the adoption of new ideas to overcome the pressing challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. The second kind of category of question or basket of questions is all around political and technical support. And this is really about assessing the level of political and technical support for circular economy planning in the city context. The next is around action planning. So this kind of develops and evaluates whether the city is already on a journey to developing an action plan or a kind of roadmap, and sort of what stage that's at. So within that sort of basket of questions, there'll be about 4 questions, each with a variety of different responses to kind of accommodate varying opinions on where officials believe their city is at in developing a roadmap or gathering data. Then internal processes and capacity. This is kind of to gain input on, to what extent the political offices are staffed or resourced directly related to circular economy implementation, and what kind of processes exist to guide the circular economy transition process. The next is stakeholder engagement, and I heard, I think Patricia brought up the importance of stakeholder and strong stakeholder engagement earlier. It's kind of, the city can't implement circular economy on its own. It's a process that involves society and the communities that it affects. And this section really assesses the readiness of the city to work with the relevant stakeholders on circular economy. The next is knowledge management, and this section really screens the readiness to monitor progress towards a circular economy and set a baseline. So this is more related to data. How much data is there? What sort of data is being held within the kind of technical and political offices in a city? And then the last question is circular economy in your city, and that's really just to understand what's going on. It kind of relates quite strongly to the first question around circular vision, but this is a question around what is currently happening. What are the projects that are on the ground running going forward versus what do you see in the future? What do you see the circular economy providing, and what do you see the circular economy being able to overcome as transition takes place?
Sounds interesting, and these topics looks quite broad, but I know for the work they are going to be streamlined to meet whatever need that is set for it to meet. I'm just wondering what the challenges you anticipate or have already started facing with regards to these projects.
Sure. So I've split the challenges kind of into 2 pieces. One from the side of the participant, and then one from the side of us, surveys and people doing this research. And I think a lot of these challenges have kind of been touched on already, actually, in the first discussion, which is quite cool. But from a participant perspective, we've already found that there are varying ideas and responses on a question where we might expect a simple, straightforward answer or everybody to answer the same thing. It's a challenge, but it's also a really interesting finding, is that people's perspectives and ideas around circular economy are so different and so varied within the same kind of city context. Another challenge is obviously and understandably, there's very much a sector-specific view on circular economy. But how do we kind of move to a more systemic view of circular economy and systems thinking to understand more about how different sectors and departments are interacting related to circular economy? The last D is similar to what we discussed, what Eric discussed earlier, is how do participants define circular economy? We know that definitions vary a lot globally, and that leads to a variety of challenges. And really, what we were speaking about earlier is kind of in the measurement, there's so many metrics and so many definitions that pose to perhaps undermine the idea of circular economy, if not kind of agreed on early on. Then from our side, I think there are a few things we've got to be aware of. There's inherent bias. Are the questions that we've developed always appropriate for the cities we are interviewing? And I think that speaks to the idea of us remaining agile and continuing to develop our survey to improve our understanding and improve responses. Is a survey too long? This is something we've experienced, and I think a lot of people who put out surveys experiences. How do we keep the participants' attention throughout the period? And is it something that they're keen and interested in completing? And does our survey allow for emergent ideas or topics, or is it too prescriptive, and does it prevent certain ideas from being expressed? And that's another thing that we just need to be aware of and keep our blinkers on, and just ensure that we really do allow the people we are interviewing to speak. And as Patricia also said earlier, allow this to be a needs-based assessment as well, which I think is really, really important.
Right, Eric. Thank you. Looks like you have to work through quite some journey to get this through, but like they say, it's always good to know what you're up against. Then you can be able to sort out what the solutions are. My final question would be what's in it for cities that participate in this, or what's the benefits for them? Because we know local governments have to be in their business. They have a lot that they are doing on their plate. So why would you want a city to commit to this project?
Yeah, so I think for us, I think this survey will be a really valuable way for us to understand, firstly, whether cities are interested in developing city-level roadmaps or frameworks for circular economy implementation in their cities. And I think the results of the survey will also help us provide means to provide feedback to cities based on their responses on how best to design a framework or a roadmap, or just simply an approach to accelerate the circular transition in their cities. I think to include the city's desires, needs, challenges into the design of kind of the circular transition or circular economy policies from the start is really, really important. So I think there's a lot that we can extract from the survey, and through developing these tailored trainings, for example, that are coming up really soon, and building in a lot of the findings that we find, and we'll be able to feed back to cities in a way that will benefit them on their transition to a more circular economy in their context.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we've exhausted our time. Jukudu is here to remind us about that. But key points that you just mentioned, the stuck out, is the need to accelerate our transition to the circular economy. And to do that, we need all hands on deck, especially governments, because they oversee whatever goes on in these towns or cities. And if the systems are not corrected, then whatever we do in smaller quantities, or the details that we do, would not really make any much impact. And so we also need data to do that in a guided way. That's how we need both qualitative and quantitative data to support whatever transition or whatever solutions we want to effect. And doing that with people also means ownership, because then people get feedback from whatever responses they are given, and you can just say, this is what you're saying, this is what we can do through the feedback. Thanks, Eric, and we hope to hear more about this work later when things are set into motion and they are also completed. I'll hand over to Jukudu, who's going to speak with Eric about Footprints project that is focusing not on cities but on businesses. Let me not say too much. Hi, Jukudu.
Thank you, Deborah. I think before we get to Eric, just to say thank you to Matthew for the perspective that he's shared. I think the work that ICLEI has done, as Deborah, you mentioned when you started off, seems quite high level when you look at it from the outside looking in. But as you've seen from what Matthew has presented, there are different ways in which you can measure circular economy and for different purposes. And here the value is in trying to get the whole picture. Something that Matthew emphasized was that quantitative data gives us the why. It tells us the story behind what is happening, what direction needs to be taken, what should the vision be. And this works quite well for cities. And so I think from Eric, what we're now going to see is perhaps a different way in which you can measure circularity. And this is specifically looking at a tool that asks, how can you measure circularity and quantify that? And it's not to say that one approach is better than the other, but that sometimes they might actually work together in order to give a clear vision of what circular economy is and how you're measuring it and what progress you're making. So I'd like to invite you, Eric, to share with us the work that you've been doing with Footprints Africa. If you could maybe start off by just giving us a quick introduction to yourself, and then sharing with us what the work has been, and jumping straight into also the strategic circular economy impact assessment, which is what they have been working on. Over to you, Eric.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jukudu. Yeah, so I'm really happy to start the presentation of our part of the measurement work. And I think indeed, as you just said, Jukudu, it's kind of complementary, these two approaches, the qualitative and the more quantitative way. So I'm also really looking forward to explore that in the second breakout room, which we try to reflect a bit more on what the differences are between these approaches and how they can complement each other. But to start off, my name is Erik Roos Lindgren. I'm from the Netherlands, working in Italy, and I did my PhD in circular economy as part of a project called Cresting. What we did is we tried to find scientific answers to the question, what does it mean for a business to measure their level of circular economy, of circularity? An interesting question, which has many sides, as we just discussed in the presentation now. And that resulted in the production of this measurement framework, which is kind of a continuous work in progress. It's called Strategic Circular Economy Impact Assessment Framework. And I will tell you a bit about how we are now using that framework with Footprints Africa, with a small cohort of circular economy businesses in different African countries. So to start off, and this point has come back quite a couple of times already, there are as many metrics as there are interpretations of the circular economy. This has direct implications for the amount of metrics, but also for the complexity of the field, and to really harmonize this. That's, I think, where a big challenge still lies. And just to give an insight, and I know we have talked about standardization before, also with Shania in the previous breakout room. This is the work that ISO, the International Standardization Organization, is currently doing to be able to standardize the measurement of circular economy. They're basically creating a very large inventory of different circular economy metrics. And interestingly, they found around 200 categories of indicators. And these categories then also include metrics or indicators themselves. So for me, this really struck me as an example of how broad this field really is. And then, of course, the challenge as well, if you're a company, if you're a business, which metric to select?
Eric, just quickly there on that point, I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on that. What you presented is actually a number of indicators, and I think this could sound very overwhelming for businesses or anyone who's trying to collect data on circular economy. So I was wondering maybe if you could just expand a bit on what does that mean in terms of the data that gets collected and the type of data, as well as how that supports circular economy measurement.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial question. I think the process of data collection is currently indicated by many businesses as a barrier to start to measure, not only because the data might not be there, because usually it is, but just to know which data to select to be able to feed into these indicators. And then something else that we mentioned just now, also in the recap of the first breakout room, is what do you do with that outcome? If you put it through a certain indicator or certain metric, that's not the end point. So we really also in our research and also with our work with Footprints, we really try to see this measurement as a process, as kind of a step-by-step journey from thinking of the questions to ask, to finding what kind of boundaries you have to set for your measurement, to collecting data, to then making calculations with the data, and then I think the most important step, to actually make decisions based on what comes out of that. And what we see in research is that companies are generally using that both for internal improvements, so optimizing processes, seeing what the impacts are, how to improve, goal setting, etc., to communicating these externally. So communicating the results of this impact assessment process, and maybe also a bit of reflection on the process itself to customers, investors, funders, governments, etc. And one, let's say, fundamental aspect of that is that we know that not every circular economy strategy actually delivers the impact that is promised. And that can be intentional or not, but for example, certain recycling processes, they consume a lot of energy. And if you calculate the emission impacts of all that energy that goes into the process, it might actually be higher than using a new product instead of recycling it. So these are the kind of questions that we're dealing with in the measurement work right now. So just to give you a little bit of background of how we built this framework, we did this in the PhD project that I mentioned before, a European project with work package 5. And you can see there my colleagues, we used to work together for 3 years. And we worked on providing these answers to measurement questions. And what we did is we designed this assessment framework based on literature, but also based on experiences from companies. And that is connecting to the needs-based element. We tried to validate this assessment framework, both with methodological experts, so people from consultancy companies and also from research, but we also tried to get the input through focus groups from companies, from the people that actually have to implement a framework like this. And then we used their feedback and tried to revise and revise the framework until we had something that we thought is actually feasible in practice and still able to accurately represent circular economy impacts. So this is what the core of the framework looked like. And this is what we said before, trying to establish a shared understanding of what circular economy means. It looks a bit sciencey, but what you see in the middle in the figure is that you have circular economy, resource efficiency strategies, basically a big umbrella under which all kinds of circular economy strategies are falling. These strategies have impacts on the social, environmental, and economic domains. So what we try to do is not only say how circular is something, but really what are the impacts of any kind of this huge collection of circular economy strategies, from recycling to simply avoiding resources to any kind of reverse logistics strategy or product service systems, you name it. We try to really think, well, what are the impacts of these solutions?
Could I please stop you there quickly with just one more question?
Sure.
So I think this ties in quite well to the point that you started with, but also the one that you took from the discussion around the breakout rooms, which was that we are all defining circular economy differently. And so I was just wondering what the thought process was behind choosing social, environmental, as well as economic pillars as sort of like what framed your approach.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think I have to acknowledge that there's a lot of overlap between these different domains as well. So what we did is we kind of used the PPP, the People, Planet, Profit frame, that is usually used in sustainability science, which kind of separates these three domains of impact on the environment, on the society, and on economy. But in my view, they're pretty much interlinked. And that's also why we try to put these arrows between the different domains to show that they don't operate in isolation. And environmental degradation has a serious impact on societies as well. But this was a way to, in order to think about the metrics that we can use, we made this categorization, and that will come back a bit later in the framework as well. So very briefly, the framework aims to be holistic. So indeed, as you said, you could have taken into account these three domains. It works from a life cycle perspective. So it really tries to take, to go beyond a company's boundaries, but really take a supply chain or value chain perspective all the way from extraction of resources, processing them, using them, disposing of them. It's designed to be flexible and modular. So companies with perhaps a lower maturity or lower experience with measurement are also able to use it, connecting back to the point of, let's say, applicability that we discussed before. It's built on existing assessment tools, so we're not reinventing the wheel. We're trying to use knowledge that's already out there, and it's supposed to assist companies with strategic decision making. So not only on the operational level, but really also to plan out which kind of circular economy strategy they want to implement. This is what it looks like, and it is quite huge. So I will not go into the details of the framework. This is something, if you have any questions about it, feel free to shoot us an email, or we can discuss it in a bit of the end of the presentation. What I wanted to highlight now is that you have these, as I said before, assessment is really a process from starting out with your point of departure, thinking about we have to make a decision, we have to measure something. Well, think about what you want to achieve with this measurement process. Then identification is really about setting your scope and thinking, how do we collect data? Is it about resource flows, energy use, other data? Then the diagnosis step is about connecting these data points. So let's say your resource use to their impacts on the social, environmental, and economic domain, and then developing solutions to target your priority impacts. So really have focus on what you want to achieve. There's a bunch of methods in there, and I will not explain them in detail now, but please feel free to reach out.
Eric, so I think I agree with you that this is quite complex, and I think as we delve deeper into this, it's going to get more in depth, and there's going to be a lot of information to digest. So maybe if you could just quickly highlight for us, or even just point out from this framework what is important and most feasible for companies to adopt, and especially when it comes to, say, businesses that are quite new to circular economy or still young businesses in their fields. How do they then adapt this framework to their context, and perhaps starting to think through that while we go deeper into the different aspects of the framework?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And maybe something I should have mentioned before is that for a company to be able to apply it, we wanted the framework to be modular. So we are not asking from companies, especially if they're just starting out with this journey of measurement, to follow all the steps. And that's something that is highlighted here in point 1.3 of the framework. And that's perhaps the most important to highlight now. So thanks for pointing that out. It all starts also with determining what kind of experience you have. And I think if you start from scratch, we would recommend to select, let's say, your scope of measurement, so what you want to know and what you can and cannot include, collect some data, and that can be also 80% of the resource flow that your company is responsible for. And then in the third step, connect those to the environmental impacts. That's something that we're doing now with a couple of companies in the first cohort that we're working with. And their level of experience is varying, but not all of them have experience with these kind of metrics and techniques. So this was also a way to be able to work with companies and really ask if they're able to make use of the framework. As a bit of background, we've been working with these companies for 3-4 months now, starting in February. So we have 5 companies in total that are part of this first cohort with, as I said, different levels of experience of measurement. But it was quite crucial that they have the ambition to engage with measurement. So that's how we included them. This project was also supported by Grid Arundel, and we really tried to take the companies from end to finish. So start the measurement process with them and complete it using the framework as kind of the blueprint for going through all these steps. Very briefly, these are the companies that are participating now. So it goes from plastic recycling company in Ghana to a small scale composting company in Côte d'Ivoire to a company that's providing technological solutions to connect construction materials to builders. So very diverse group in different African regions we're very grateful to be able to collaborate with them and to get their enthusiastic response to what we would like to do with them. So if there's still a bit of time, I would like to take a couple of minutes to describe some process level results. And I think then it would be a good moment to move to a discussion with the group in the breakout room again to see if there's any kind of interesting differences between these measurement approaches or if there's any questions that come up from you. Something interesting, I think, is that the measurement goals of all the companies that are included in the first cohort are quite different. So, and I think we mentioned it before, measurement is not just I want to measure, it's really thinking about what do I want to know? How do I get that information? And here you see some of these goals. So, for example, comparing impact hotspots. So within your company, you have different activities and some of them might have a higher impact than others. So that could be something that you asked. Another company asked, well, we're working on a new design solution. We wondered what is the impact comparison in the new design compared to the old one? Another question could be, we provide a new technology that replaces a conventional product. What's the difference in environmental impact? So you can see all the way from the start, your kind of measurement approach can be very different depending on the measurement goal that you have. Something that we found now, and that relates back to what you said, Jokuru, like, is this actually feasible for companies? And we were really impressed with the way that the companies were able to deliver data in this very short time frame. And in some cases, we had direct support on the ground with the facilities that were there. And in other cases, we used photos and videos or live calls to better understand their operations. And they were really able to deliver the data that we needed in many cases, with one note, and that is social impact assessment, and that perhaps goes more into the qualitative side of things, is much more time intensive. So we haven't really been able to jump into that at this stage. A bit more technical, but we found that the methods that we proposed in the framework do seem to be feasible in these cases. With again, a couple of notes. One of them is access to software is important, and these software systems are not very accessible. That's something we need to think about as a community. We have different kind of technical issues related to how you allocate certain resource flows in creating this environmental modeling system. If you're a life cycle assessment enthusiast, please feel free to reach out and discuss this. And then something pretty important is that we see that if you use general data, that it's very hard to capture local differences and site-specific impacts, meaning that carbon emission numbers on a global scale are available, but if you really zoom into a specific region, it becomes much harder to find this concrete data. So various challenges still, and we're still interested in many of these questions, such as what are the capabilities of a company to be able to measure their impacts? At the same time, we see this process has been valuable to the participating companies, and we're now presenting the results to all of them in these in the past week, and in this week we will have some results presentation sessions, and we're really happy to receive some positive feedback from them. Of course, the measurement can still be sharpened a bit, some system boundaries can be changed slightly, but overall it seems to have been valuable for companies to accurately reflect on their impacts. We're working now to document these lessons, talk to the companies, see how we can improve the framework and improve these kind of processes, and synthesize lessons that can then be transferred to companies, other businesses working in circular economy that are interested in this. I think that's it for now. It's a kind of a flavor of what we're doing now with the framework. I couldn't go in depth in all of the different elements, but I hope that it sparked some inspiration. And I also hope it raised questions for you. And to reflect on some of these questions, we prepared another breakout room session. I see we're still roughly on schedule. We have 15 minutes for the entire session. So two questions that we had for the final breakout session was, from these two frameworks that you saw, which elements were most surprising to you? And please also reflect on what is missing or what you would still see differently in these frameworks to be able to measure circular economy impacts.
We are all back from our breakout rooms. I think everyone should have had some interesting discussions in there. So we're looking forward to hearing some of your insights. Could I quickly call on Deborah to take us through one or two insights before we close?
Sorry, Jikudu, I think we lost Deborah in our breakout room. She seemed to have frozen.
Oh, okay, that's not a problem. Please do not mind the dogs in my background. Could I maybe start with you, Dashanya, to share what you had discussed in your breakout room?
Yeah, sure. I think what we discussed is mainly that we would like to understand more about the framework. So it was obviously just very high level. And, you know, we'd like to be given the opportunity to be able to look at it in more detail before giving such an in-depth comment. But I mean, we kind of had a discussion around how I was saying how I had seen in most of the projects that I had worked in, how the social and environment and the social and economic have to enable the environmental. So environmental isn't really a driver, unfortunately. So if the economics make sense and it has some sort of social impact, the environmental, it has to be unlocked through that. And yeah, I think that was the main point. I also had Nicole in my group in case she wants to add anything. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dashanya. I think what you shared is important, and it speaks back to what's been said in today's session, which is the importance of process. And when you think of the circular economy, it's never just about, say, one sector. It's about all the interlinkages and how they feed in together to improve how a system is working. could we maybe just quickly get one final reflection from the group that had Matthew? I'm not sure who was your spokesperson from that group, but please do share a reflection.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to speak on behalf of the group, or Rasak, please come in if you would like to. But I think, Rasak, you actually made a really important point around kind of the complementary nature of quantitative and qualitative data, and the combination of the two, and how the qualitative can explain and give context to the quantitative. And I think that's particularly important when we're looking at measuring circular economy in African cities. I don't know if you want to speak a bit further to that, Rasak.
Although we might not be able to hear from Rasak at the moment, thank you so much, Matthew, for the reflection and for reminding us about the different approaches that have been presented today, the qualitative versus the quantitative, and how they feed well into each other, as well as support different ways in which we can measure circularity and support better and improved decision-making. Deborah is back in the room with us. I don't know if you would like to help close us out. I think this has been quite a great session, and although we weren't able to hear from everyone, it's been interesting hearing the different perspectives, especially joining the different breakout rooms and hearing what has been said. So thank you everyone for participating. Over to you, Deborah.
Hi, Jakudu. Okay, Patricia, is your hand now coming up, or did you want to say something?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, I was in a group, but I haven't seen any of my members presenting, so I don't know whether I should proceed or.
Please share this one and let's use that to close.
Sorry?
You can share.
Okay, yes. So what we picked is related to the previous discussion on standardization of the frameworks and tools, because even some of our members are from other sessions and they already have a different number of indicators from what was presented. And as it was alluded with the first group, it wasn't easy for us to distinguish between the two frameworks that we were presented to. So that just shows how much we need to have like a standard format for us to uptake. And for industries or manufacturers or any firms, it's also tedious to undertake this measurement or evaluation in daily operation, routine operations, because even if you contract it out, what if this firm comes and does it with a different framework from what you did it before? How do you ensure the validity, the quality, how sure you're about how reliable it is? So that even brings it a bigger question to at city level, if that can be at a challenge at an institutional level or in an industry, how more tedious or it can be contentious at a wider scope. So those are the kind of discussions we had, and yeah, it was connected to the previous session. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Patricia. We love to hear your feedback, so we are grateful. And I'm sure everything has been said and done in the session, and we are grateful that everybody joined. It looks like what we are all finally saying is that measurements or measuring the data circular economy is very essential to support the transition or to accelerate our transition to a circular economy. And so we need to do that. I see a lot coming up around standardization. Maybe a topic ICLEI and Footprint would have to discuss more in details. And I'd like to go to what Lizelle dropped in the comment section some time ago, that we cannot manage what we cannot measure. And that's what also makes this measurement project very, very important. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we've also dropped a link to a feedback form, kindly do well to respond to that and give us feedback. They are always welcome. And we hope to see you some other time. Enjoy the rest of the RISE session, and bye.